Hello, and welcome to History at Bedtime. The story of Genghis Khan begins on the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century, in a world where survival depended on horses, clan loyalty, winter discipline, and the ability to read danger before it arrived. Before he became Genghis Khan, he was Temujin, the son of a minor chieftain, abandoned after his father's death, forced to survive in a society where betrayal was not an exception but part of the political order. His rise was not a simple legend about a heroic founder, and it was not only a sequence of battles. It was the reorganization of a fractured steppe world into a military and political system powerful enough to break empires that had seemed immovable. It produced destroyed cities, displaced populations, new trade routes, religious tolerance, imperial law, and a connected Eurasia that changed the course of medieval history. The sources for this life are difficult, and that difficulty matters. We have the secret history of the Mongols, Persian chroniclers writing after catastrophe, Chinese records written inside systems the Mongols conquered or ruled, later traditions, administrative traces, and physical evidence from a violently connected world. The task is not to turn Genghis Khan into a monster or a hero. The task is to understand how a man from the edge of the steppe built a system that moved faster, absorbed talent more effectively, punished resistance more severely, and rewarded loyalty more reliably than the states around him expected. The question is not simply how many lands he conquered. The more important question is how a society of mobile herders, divided by feud and clan rivalry, became an imperial machine capable of defeating Chinese dynasties, Islamic cities, Rus principalities, and armies that believed distance itself would protect them. The answer lies in organization as much as violence, in decimal military units, in discipline, in intelligence networks, in the use of engineers and administrators from conquered peoples, and in a political imagination that treated loyalty as something that could be built across bloodlines rather than inherited only through them. This is why his story still matters. It is not comfortable history, and it should not be made comfortable. It is the history of conquest, state formation, terror, trade, law, communication, and cultural transmission on a continental scale. To understand Genghis Khan is to understand how destruction and connection could come from the same system, and how the medieval world became more tightly linked because of an empire that began far from the cities it would eventually transform. To understand him, we begin with the environment that made him, the open grasslands of Mongolia. The Mongolian steppe is one of the great landscapes of the earth. It is not dramatic in the way that mountains or oceans are dramatic. It does not assault the senses with vertical grandeur or the restless energy of deep water. Its power is quieter and more patient than that. It is the power of enormous horizontal distance, of a sky that occupies more of the visual field than the earth beneath it, of grass that runs in every direction to the limit of what the eye can reach. In summer, the steppe is green and alive, the air full of the smell of grass and dung and horses, the sound of wind and the distant calls of birds. In winter, it becomes something else entirely, a world of extraordinary cold, the grass buried under snow, the wind carrying temperatures that kill the unprepared with casual efficiency, the sky going on forever in pale white and gray. To live in such a place was to understand that shelter was not a fixed address, but a skill. The Mongol home, the gur, could be taken down, loaded onto animals or carts, and raised again in another valley when the herds needed fresh pasture. Its circular walls were made from a wooden lattice, covered with thick felt that kept out wind and cold. At the center burned the hearth, not only for warmth, but as the heart of family life. Around it, people slept, repaired tack, mended clothing, prepared milk and meat, told stories, and listened to elders recite the memory of lineages and battles. A child growing up inside a gur learned that the world was movable, that safety was something a family carried with it, and that the circle of home could be remade wherever the grass was good and the horses could feed. The seasons shaped everything. Summer was a season of movement and abundance. When Mares gave milk, lambs and foals grew stronger, and distant camps could gather for trade, marriage arrangements, and ceremony. Winter was harsher and more intimate. Families clustered in sheltered valleys, conserved fuel, watched animals carefully, and listened for changes in the weather that might mean survival or disaster. A storm could bury pasture under ice and kill animals by the thousands. Hunger was never an abstract possibility on the steppe. It was a presence people knew by name. This helped produce a society in which generosity mattered, because a family with too many animals one year might need help the next, and in which betrayal was remembered for generations, because abandonment could mean death. The steppe also taught attention. A rider had to read hoof prints, cloud movement, the quality of grass, the behavior of animals before a storm, the direction of smoke from a distant camp, the silence that might mean danger. This was not book learning, but it was knowledge of a high order. It trained memory, patience, and quick judgment. When Genghis Khan later moved armies across distances that astonished settled civilizations, he was drawing on this older education, the education of people who had learned, since childhood, to read a huge landscape as if it were a written page. The people who lived on this steppe in the 12th century, in the generations before Genghis Khan, were organized into clans and tribes that were in more or less constant competition with each other for the resources the land provided. These were not primitive people in the way that word is sometimes used to diminish. They were sophisticated practitioners of a way of life that the steppe required, mobile, adaptive, skilled in the management of horses and cattle and sheep across enormous distances, expert hunters and fighters, with complex social structures, rich oral traditions, and a deep knowledge of the landscape they inhabited. But they were also fragmented. The clans fought each other. Alliances formed and broke. Betrayals were common. Children were taken as slaves. Women were abducted. The cycle of raid and counter-raid, revenge and revenge for revenge, ran through the steppe world in a pattern that had no obvious end. Into this world, somewhere around 1162 CE, the exact date is not certain, and different sources give different years. A boy was born to a minor Mongol chieftain named Yasujiai and his wife Holan. The boy was named Temujin, reportedly after a Tatar chieftain whom Yasujiai had captured just before the birth. The name would later be set aside in favor of the title by which history knows him. But for now, he was simply Temujin, a child born into a world of uncertainty, in a felt tent somewhere on the banks of the Onan River, in the northeastern corner of what is now Mongolia. The early life of Temujin, as recorded in the secret history of the Mongols, the extraordinary 13th century text that is the primary Mongolian source for his life, was marked by difficulty and loss from a very early age. When Temujin was approximately 9 years old, his father Yasujiai was poisoned by Tatars while returning from arranging his son's betrothal to a girl named Borte from a neighboring tribe. With Yasujiai gone, the clan that had followed him abandoned his family. They left Holan and her children behind, refusing to follow a widow and a child. The family survived for some years on the steppe on their own, gathering wild plants and hunting small game. The secret history describes this period with a plainness that makes it more affecting, not less. A mother and her children, alone on the steppe, keeping themselves alive. These early years of hardship shaped Temujin in ways that would be visible throughout his life. He learned, at an age when other children of his class might have been learning to take comfort and security for granted, that nothing could be taken for granted. He learned the loyalty that comes from shared suffering. He learned the fragility of power structures built only on birth and tradition. And he learned, perhaps most importantly, something about himself, that he was capable of surviving conditions that destroyed others, that he could find resources in himself and in the people around him that the world would not necessarily provide. Holun's role in this survival cannot be treated as background. She held the family together after Yasuji's followers abandoned them, and in the moral universe of the secret history, her endurance is one of the foundations of Temujin's later greatness. She did not command armies. She did not sit at a Kurultai surrounded by white standards. But she taught her children the first lesson of power, that a household can become a small state when everyone else is turned away. She gathered food, negotiated danger, kept memory alive, and refused to let her sons think of themselves as finished because other people had decided they were no longer useful. This is a quiet but important historical truth. The largest empire in land history begins not with a battlefield, but with a mother and children looking for roots and fish and berries in a landscape that could have swallowed them. Temujin's later insistence that loyalty mattered more than noble birth was not merely a political invention. It came from lived experience. Birth had not saved him. Clan tradition had not saved him. What had saved him was the stubborn loyalty of a few people who stayed. There is a story from this early period that has been preserved in the secret history, and that tells us something important about who Temujin was becoming. As a boy, he killed his half-brother Bektir in a dispute over food and hunting rights. The killing troubled his mother deeply and is not presented in the Mongol sources as something admirable, but it is presented as something significant, as evidence of a will that would not accept the constraints placed upon it, a refusal of the subordinate position that circumstances had imposed. The boy who killed his half-brother rather than accept a hierarchy that did not serve him would grow up to challenge and overthrow hierarchies on a rather larger scale. The young Temujin was at one point captured by the Tajik clan, an enemy of his family, and held prisoner wearing a wooden kang, a neckboard that made it difficult to sleep or move comfortably. He escaped, or was helped to escape, by a sympathetic family, and the experience of captivity and the kindness of the family who helped him were both things he remembered and acted upon years later. He rescued the son of that family from slavery, and he did not forgive the Tajuts for a very long time. The marriage to Borte, when Temujin was old enough to claim it, was one of the foundational relationships of his life. Borte's family was more prominent than his own at the time of the arrangement, and the marriage brought Temujin both a capable and loyal wife and a connection to a broader network of relationships that he needed. But almost immediately after the marriage, disaster struck. A rival tribe, the Merkits, kidnapped Borte in a raid that was partly revenge for an earlier kidnapping involving Temujin's own parents. Borte was taken and given to a Merkit man as a wife. Temujin's response to this crisis reveals something essential about his character and his emerging approach to power. Rather than attempting to rescue Borte himself with the limited forces he had, Temujin reached out to the most powerful men he could access: his father's old sworn brother, Togrul Khan of the Karates, and his own childhood companion Jamuka, who was the leader of another Mongol clan. Together, the three men assembled a force large enough to attack the Merkits and recover Borte. The raid was successful. Borte was rescued, and the episode established a pattern that would define Temujin's rise to power: the building of alliances, the willingness to ask for help rather than act alone out of pride, and the transformation of personal crises into political opportunities. The child Borte bore shortly after her return, a son named Joki, whose name means guest, carried a shadow of uncertainty about his paternity that would cause complicated dynamics within the family for the rest of his life. Temujin acknowledged Joki as his son and treated him as such, but the question was never entirely laid to rest, and it would have consequences decades later in the organization of the empire. The relationship with Jamuka is one of the most fascinating and emotionally complex threads in the early life story. Jamuka and Temujin were Anda, sworn brothers, blood brothers. bound by a ritual exchange that in Mongol culture created an obligation as strong as biological brotherhood. They camped together, rode together, led joint campaigns together. And then, after a period of shared success, they separated. The reasons for the separation are not entirely clear from the sources, but what followed it was decades of alternating alliance and conflict that ended only with Jamuka's death. A death that he reportedly chose on his own terms rather than accept the subordinate position that life under Temujin would have required. The shadow of Jamuka lies over the entire early narrative of Temujin's rise. They were born to similar circumstances, both capable men, both possessed of political intelligence and military skill. What differentiated them, ultimately, was the quality of the loyalty they inspired and the breadth of the vision each held for what the steppe world might become. Jamuka represented a more traditional approach, the maintenance of the existing clan hierarchies, with himself at the top. Temujin represented something more radical, a restructuring of the entire steppe social order around ability and loyalty rather than birth and clan affiliation. This restructuring was not simply an abstract political philosophy. It was a practical response to the world Temujin had grown up in and understood deeply. The clan system, as it existed, was a source of constant instability. Clans could abandon their leaders, as his father's clan had abandoned his family, and the resulting fragmentation made the steppe Mongols vulnerable to manipulation by their more settled neighbors, particularly the Jurchen Jin dynasty of northern China, which had a policy of playing Mongol tribes against each other to prevent any unified threat. Temujin saw this clearly and spent the years of his rise dismantling the conditions that made it possible. The process of Temujin's unification of the Mongol tribes took approximately 20 years, from roughly the 1180s to 1206. It was not a smooth process. There were defeats as well as victories, betrayals as well as loyalties, periods of desperation as well as periods of expansion. But through all of it, certain consistent principles were visible. Enemies who surrendered and submitted were incorporated rather than destroyed. Their warriors became Mongol warriors. Their leaders were given positions based on demonstrated ability. Their populations were absorbed into the growing whole. Enemies who continued to resist were treated with severity that became increasingly legendary as time went on. And the people who remained loyal to Temujin across the difficult years were rewarded with a consistency and generosity that built a culture of loyalty deeper than anything the old clan system had produced. The new army he built was organized not by clan affiliation but by decimal units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, with commanders assigned to these units based on ability and loyalty, regardless of their original tribe or family. This organizational principle was revolutionary in its context. It broke the old power of the clan chiefs by inserting a military hierarchy above and across the clan structure, creating a loyalty to the unit and to Temujin himself that superseded the older loyalties. Warriors from formerly enemy tribes found themselves serving alongside each other in the new decimal system, developing new loyalties that cut across the old divisions. This decimal organization did something more than make armies easier to command. It remade identity. A warrior who had once belonged first to a clan now belonged also to a unit. His brothers in that unit might come from families that had once been enemies. They camped together, rode together, stood guard together, shared food, and were punished together if one of them failed. Responsibility became collective. If one man deserted, others could be held accountable. If a unit performed well, the honor belonged to all. In this way, the army became a school of new loyalties, and those loyalties slowly replaced the fractured loyalties of the old steppe. Discipline in the Mongol army was strict, sometimes severe, but it was not chaotic cruelty. It was the discipline of a system in which survival depended on coordination. A rider who broke ranks at the wrong moment could ruin a feigned retreat. A scout who failed to report what he had seen could endanger an entire column. A commander who took plunder before the proper time could turn victory into disorder. Genghis Khan's laws and customs tried to hold all of this together by making obedience predictable and reward reliable. His warriors knew that courage might raise a man far beyond his birth, and that betrayal would not be forgotten. The result was a force that did not need a city, a wall, or a permanent barracks to be organized. It could carry organization with it across the grass. It could appear as scattered riders and then gather into a single striking force. It could vanish beyond the horizon and then return from another direction days later. To enemies watching from city walls or from the ranks of heavy infantry, it often seemed almost impossible to understand. But it was not magic. It was structure, training, memory, and the habits of the steppe turned into military form. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai held on the banks of the Onon River, the same river beside which Temujin had been born, the assembled Mongol chiefs and chieftains acknowledged him as their supreme ruler and gave him the title by which history knows him, Genghis Khan. The exact meaning of the title is debated. It is usually translated as universal ruler or oceanic ruler or something similar, conveying the idea of a sovereignty without limits. The white standards planted in the ground at the Kurultai announced to the world that the Mongols were unified, that they had a leader, and that the world outside the steppe should take notice. He was perhaps in his mid-40s at this point. The first half of his life had been preparation. The second half would be conquest. The Mongol military system that Genghis Khan refined and employed was one of the most effective in the pre-gunpowder era, and understanding it requires setting aside some of the popular images that surround it. The Mongol army was not simply a horde, a disorganized mass of riders charging in every direction. It was a highly disciplined, carefully organized, tactically sophisticated force that combined extraordinary mobility with a range of capabilities that most armies of the era could not match. The foundation of everything was the horse. Mongol warriors typically maintained a string of horses, 3, 4, 5, or more per rider, allowing them to switch mounts regularly and maintain a pace of movement that astonished their adversaries. An army that could cover 50 to 100 miles in a day, sustained over many days, could appear where it was not expected, could cut off retreating forces, could strike before defenders were fully prepared. This mobility was not merely a matter of having fast horses. It was a system of horse management, of rider fitness, of logistical support, of tactical doctrine built around the assumption of speed, that took generations to develop and could not be simply imitated by outsiders who observed it in action. The Mongol composite bow was the most powerful personal weapon in the ancient and medieval world outside of the siege engine. Made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, carefully shaped and glued and left to cure, the composite bow could drive an arrow with lethal force at distances of more than 200 meters, and in skilled hands at significantly greater distances for harassment fire. Mongol warriors trained from childhood in the use of the bow from horseback, one of the most demanding skills in the military repertoire, and the combination of accurate archery with the speed of the mounted steppe warrior created a military problem that few armies of the era had effective answers to. The Mongols were also, contrary to some popular impressions, highly capable siege engineers. This capability was not original to them. They developed it through the incorporation of Chinese and later Central Asian and Persian engineering expertise into their forces. But once developed, Mongol siege capability was formidable. Catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, mining operations, diversion of water supplies, psychological pressure. The Mongol approach to siege warfare was systematic and patient, and very few fortified positions that they chose to take seriously remained untaken. The tactical repertoire of the Mongol army included a particularly famous maneuver that their adversaries found very difficult to counter: the feigned retreat. Mongol forces would engage an enemy, begin to pull back in apparent disorder, draw the enemy forces forward in pursuit, and then, when the pursuing forces were spread out and committed, wheel around in a coordinated reversal and destroy them. The feigned retreat required extraordinary discipline from the retreating forces, who had to maintain formation and cohesion while appearing to flee, and then respond instantly and in coordination to the signal to reverse. It was the opposite of what most soldiers wanted to do in a crisis situation, and the fact that Mongol units could execute it reliably under combat conditions speaks to the quality of their training and their command structure. The psychological dimension of Mongol warfare was as important as the military dimension, and Genghis Khan understood this with unusual clarity. Cities that surrendered immediately were typically treated with relative leniency. Their population spared, their merchants allowed to continue their activities, their religious institutions protected. Cities that resisted were treated with calculated severity designed to send a message to every other city within hearing distance. The message worked. As the Mongol reputation spread ahead of their armies, many cities chose surrender over resistance, making the Mongol advance faster and less costly than it would otherwise have been. The severity was not random or purely sadistic. It was a tool applied with cold deliberation to achieve a specific effect. The tactical genius of the Mongol generals, operating within the system Genghis Khan created, produced specific battlefield outcomes that military historians study to this day. The Battle of the Indus in 1221, in which Genghis Khan personally commanded against the Khwarezmian prince Jalal ad-Din, is considered one of the most skillfully executed battles of the medieval world. Jalal ad-Din had assembled a force on the banks of the Indus River, using the river as a defensive barrier on one side. Genghis Khan divided his forces, sent a flanking column across the river upstream to cut off retreat, and then attacked frontally while the flanking force completed the encirclement. The Khwarezmian army was destroyed. Jalal ad-Din himself escaped by plunging his horse into the river and swimming across, a feat of physical courage that Genghis Khan reportedly watched from the bank and admired enough to prevent his archers from shooting at the swimming prince. This story, the conqueror watching his escaping adversary with something like admiration rather than fury, captures something about how Genghis Khan understood the relationship between himself and the quality of his opponents. He valued excellence wherever he found it. He was not simply interested in defeating enemies. He was interested in incorporating excellence into his system. The generals who most impressed him were sometimes invited to join him. The craftsmen who produced the finest work were spared and put to work. The administrators who governed most effectively were retained in their functions. The best horses were acquired, the best weapons adopted, the best engineering techniques learned and applied. This appetite for excellence was itself a military strategy. Each conquest brought new capabilities into the Mongol system, making the next conquest more powerful. The role of intelligence and reconnaissance in Mongol military planning was as important as any tactical maneuver, and it was systematically organized in a way that gave Mongol commanders a quality of information about their adversaries that those adversaries did not reciprocate. Before any major campaign, Mongol agents, merchants, travelers, diplomats moved through the target territory, gathering information about roads and river crossings, about the disposition of defensive forces, about the personalities of local commanders, about supply conditions and food availability. This intelligence was compiled and analyzed, and the campaign plans reflected it. The Mongol advances that seemed to their adversaries to be miraculously rapid and unerringly directed were, in reality, the product of careful advance planning based on better information than the defenders possessed. The communication systems within a Mongol army in the field were also more sophisticated than popular accounts suggest. Flag signals, fire signals, and the use of organized courier systems within the army allowed commanders to coordinate units operating over distances that made verbal communication impossible. The decimal organization of the army, with its commanders of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, created a clear chain of command through which orders could be transmitted rapidly and reliably. The discipline that maintained unit cohesion during the feigned retreat, or that allowed a widely dispersed reconnaissance screen to converge on a discovered enemy in hours rather than days, required a communication and command system that functioned under pressure. The Mongol army had one. The seasonal rhythm of Mongol campaigning reflected the steppe calendar in ways that gave the Mongol forces consistent advantages. The great campaigns typically began in autumn or winter, when rivers were frozen and provided firm roads across terrain that would be impassable or slow in other seasons, when horses were at their best condition after the summer grazing, and when agricultural populations were least prepared to mount rapid defensive responses. The invasion of Russia in 1237 was launched in winter precisely because the frozen rivers allowed Mongol cavalry to move rapidly across a landscape that summer would have made much more difficult. The defenders were accustomed to thinking of winter as a natural protection, the rivers frozen solid, the cold severe enough to deter invaders. The Mongols turned this assumption inside out. The treatment of surrender was formalized in ways that made it a genuinely rational choice for many communities. Cities that surrendered before a Mongol force arrived at their walls, or that opened their gates when first summoned, were typically treated with relative leniency. The ruling elite was replaced or supplemented with Mongol representatives, a tribute was imposed, and life continued under new management. Cities that resisted and were then taken by storm were treated much more harshly. Cities that submitted were then relieved by an outside force, and resumed resistance when the Mongols appeared vulnerable were treated with the greatest severity of all. This graduated system of consequences was not random. It was a deliberate policy designed to make the calculation of submission versus resistance as clear as possible, and it was remarkably effective. The diplomatic correspondence that preceded Mongol campaigns often included letters of remarkable directness and, from the Mongol perspective, theological clarity. The letters sent by various great Khans to European rulers, demanding submission and threatening the consequences of noncompliance, were not empty rhetoric. They accurately described what would happen. The fact that European rulers received them with a mixture of outrage and disbelief, unable to credit that anyone would address them in such terms, reflects the gap between the Mongol worldview and the European one. From the Mongol perspective, the letter was an act of mercy. It offered the recipient the choice of peaceful submission before the alternative became necessary. From the European perspective, it was an insult. The gap in interpretation contributed to outcomes that both parties might otherwise have avoided. The relationship between Genghis Khan and Yelu Chukai is one of the more philosophically interesting in the history of the empire. Yelu Chukai was a Khitan scholar in the service of the Jin court, educated in the Confucian tradition, sophisticated in the ways of Chinese bureaucratic administration, and possessed of a moral seriousness that made him something of an anomaly in the Mongol court. When he first came before Genghis Khan, he was asked whether he harbored a desire for revenge against the Mongols, who had killed his father's family and overthrown the dynasty he had served. He replied that his father and grandfather had both served the Jin, and he did not regard the Jin as his enemy. Therefore, he had no desire for revenge against those who had defeated the Jin. Genghis Khan was impressed by this answer, and Yelu Chukai became his advisor. The exchange captures something about both men: the Mongol ruler's genuine respect for honest, direct answers, and the scholar's capacity to maintain his moral compass in circumstances that might have distorted it. Yalu Chutsai's contribution to the Mongol Empire was in many ways as significant as any military victory. He introduced the concept of systematic taxation, replacing the extraction of plunder with a regular schedule of levies that allowed the state to plan revenues and populations to plan their obligations. He preserved the lives of Chinese scholarly and artistic communities that might otherwise have been treated as simply enemy populations. He argued for the protection of agricultural land, understanding that the destruction of the Chinese peasant economy would ultimately impoverish the Mongol rulers more than it enriched them. His influence was not always decisive. There were powerful voices in the Mongol court who preferred the old way of taking everything available, but over time, the administrative approach he represented gained ground. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai eventually established in China was, in some of its most important characteristics, the embodiment of what Yalu Chukai had argued for. The demographic consequences of the Mongol conquests are a subject of ongoing historical debate, and the uncertainties are genuine. Medieval population data is unreliable. The chronicles that describe casualties use numbers that are clearly exaggerated, and the relationship between military destruction and subsequent demographic decline involves complex factors including disease, famine, disruption of agricultural systems, and migration. What is clear is that some regions experience severe and lasting demographic decline as a result of the Mongol campaigns. The area of modern Iran and Iraq shows evidence of significant population reduction in the 13th and 14th centuries. Central Asian oasis cities, whose populations depended on irrigated agriculture maintained by complex water management systems, were in some cases depopulated when the irrigation infrastructure was damaged or destroyed. The recovery of some of these regions took generations. In China, population records suggest a significant reduction in the northern territories during the period of Mongol conquest, though sorting out the contribution of warfare from famine, plague, and other factors is methodologically difficult. At the same time, the demographic picture is not uniformly negative even in the short term. Some regions that became part of the Mongol Empire experienced population growth rather than decline, as Mongol-enforced peace allowed settled communities to expand without the threat of raid and counter-raid. The growth of trade cities along the Silk Road routes, Kashgar, Samarkand, Tabriz, reflected real economic expansion under Mongol patronage. The agricultural colonization of some steppe margins that took place under Mongol governance increased the productive capacity of regions that had previously supported only pastoral populations. The demographic history of the Mongol period is not simple enough to be captured in a single narrative of destruction or of growth. The first great campaign that extended Mongol power beyond the steppe was directed against the Xia Kingdom, a Tangut state in what is now northwestern China, beginning in 1209. The Xia controlled important trade routes and had historically raided Mongol territory. The campaign forced the Xia to submit and pay tribute. 2 years later, in 1211, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Jurchen Jin dynasty of northern China, the same dynasty that had long manipulated the Mongol tribes against each other. The campaign against the Jin was the beginning of a military engagement that would last, with interruptions, for decades, conducted not only by Genghis Khan himself, but by his sons and successors. The campaigns against the settled states along the edges of the steppe also changed the Mongols themselves. Every city they encountered taught them something. From the Tangut and the Jin, they learned the importance of engineers, translators, clerks, and men who could read grain accounts and tax lists. From Chinese siege specialists, they learned how to bring walls down, how to build machines, how to manage a long siege without exhausting the attacking force. The Mongols did not begin as masters of urban warfare. They became masters because they were willing to learn from those they conquered, and because they did not confuse foreign expertise with weakness. This willingness to use other people's knowledge is one of the central reasons the empire expanded so quickly. A conquered craftsman could become part of the next campaign. A captured engineer might design the machine that opened the next city. A translator who knew Arabic, Chinese, Persian, or Uyghur could become as important as a warrior, because empires are not held by arrows alone. They are held by information. Genghis Khan's world grew larger each time he absorbed another skill into it. There is a grim efficiency in this, and also a strange practicality. The Mongol system did not ask whether a useful person belonged to the right culture. It asked whether that person could serve the larger order being built. This did not make conquest gentle. It did make it adaptive. The Mongol army that rode out of the steppe in the first years of the 13th century was not exactly the same army that reached Central Asia, nor the same army that later threatened Europe and ruled China. It learned as it moved. The campaign against the Jin is notable for several reasons. It was the first major engagement of the Mongol military machine against fortified cities and a large, organized state military force, and it demonstrated both the strengths and the limitations of the early Mongol approach. The Jin had the advantage of walls, of supply systems, of large infantry forces. The Mongols had the advantage of mobility, archery, and tactical flexibility. The campaign settled into a pattern of devastating raids and the taking of cities, with the Jin unable to protect their territory comprehensively and the Mongols building their siege capabilities as the campaign progressed. By 1215, Beijing, then called Zhengdu, the central capital of the Jin, fell to the Mongols after a prolonged siege. The fall of Zhengdu sent shockwaves through the settled world of East Asia. While the Jin campaign was ongoing, events in Central Asia redirected Mongol attention westward in a way that had world historical consequences. The Khwarezmian Empire, a large, wealthy Muslim state centered on what is now Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and northern Iran, had been a potential trading partner for the Mongols. Genghis Khan reportedly sent trade caravans to the Khwarezmian court in 1218. The governor of the city of Otrar, acting either on his own initiative or with the sanction of the Khwarezmian ruler, Muhammad II, had the members of the caravan arrested and executed, apparently suspecting them of espionage. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to demand justice. The ambassadors were killed. These provocations, whether the Khwarezmian ruler understood their implications or not, triggered a response that destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire entirely. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, launched in 1219, was one of the most devastating military operations of the medieval world. Genghis Khan divided his forces and struck from multiple directions simultaneously, moving with a speed and coordination that the Khwarezmian defenders found impossible to respond to effectively. City after city fell. Samarkand, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of scholarship and trade and architectural beauty, a city that travelers from across Asia and the Middle East considered among the finest in the world, fell to the Mongols in 1220. Its population was enormous and its defenses seemed formidable. The fall of Samarkand sent a message that no city, however large or wealthy or well-defended, was beyond reach. The flight of Muhammad II before the advancing Mongol forces and his death in exile on an island in the Caspian Sea is one of the more poignant episodes in the campaign. A ruler of an enormous empire reduced to a fugitive, dying alone, unable to do anything to stop the destruction of the world he had governed. His son Jalal ad-Din continued resistance with more courage and more effectiveness than his father had shown, inflicting a notable defeat on a Mongol force at the Battle of Parwan in 1221, one of the few significant Mongol reverses of this period. But he could not ultimately halt what had been set in motion, and he spent years as a fugitive, resisting until his death in 1231. The destruction visited upon the cities of Central Asia during the Khwarezmian campaign was severe and, in several cases, total. Nishapur, Merv, Herat, Urgench, ancient and wealthy cities, centers of Islamic learning and culture, repositories of manuscripts and artistic treasures accumulated over centuries, were devastated. The populations that resisted were killed in large numbers. The irrigated agricultural landscapes of Central Asia, built and maintained over centuries, were in some areas disrupted in ways that took generations to recover from. The scale of the death and destruction in Central Asia during this campaign has been debated by historians who have scrutinized the medieval sources carefully and found that the numbers cited in those sources, sometimes in the millions for individual cities, are certainly exaggerated. But even with significant discounts applied, the destruction was immense and its effects on the region were long-lasting. It is important to pause here and sit with the full complexity of what this means. Genghis Khan was a man who caused enormous suffering to individuals, to communities, to entire civilizations. The cities of Central Asia that were destroyed or damaged in his campaigns had been among the greatest centers of human learning and culture in the medieval world. The manuscripts lost, the scholars killed, the traditions broken. These are real losses, not merely statistics. Any honest account of Genghis Khan must acknowledge this directly, without minimizing it or explaining it away. At the same time, his story does not reduce to pure destruction, and understanding what he built requires looking at the full picture. The Mongol Empire, at its height and in its aftermath, created conditions that allowed the largest connected zone of trade and cultural exchange in the pre-modern world. The roads were safe. The caravans moved. The ideas traveled. What is sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was a real phenomenon. However strange it seems to apply the word peace to an empire built through violence. Within it, merchants, scholars, diplomats, and travelers moved across distances that had previously been organized into hostile and fragmented polities, and the exchange of goods and ideas that resulted had consequences for the entire subsequent history of Eurasia. Genghis Khan himself was a man of notable personal characteristics that sit awkwardly with the image of simple barbarism. He was genuinely curious about the beliefs and ideas of the peoples he encountered. He maintained a policy of religious tolerance that was remarkable for his era. Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Taoists, and shamans all found protection under Mongol authority, and their leaders were often exempted from taxation and other burdens. He convened discussions between representatives of different religious traditions, listening to arguments and asking questions. He sought out the Taoist sage Qiu Chuji, who traveled thousands of miles to meet him and spent days in discussion with him about the nature of the world and the path to long life. He was also a man who valued loyalty with an intensity that his followers found inspiring and his enemies found frightening. Those who remained loyal to him through difficulty were rewarded beyond what the old system would have considered appropriate, elevated to command positions regardless of their origin, given shares of conquest that reflected their service rather than their birth. The old Mongol servants of his household, men and women who had served him when he was a nobody on the steppe, were elevated alongside the great chiefs and generals when the empire was built. He did not forget who had been there in the difficult years, and he made sure they knew it. The legal code he promulgated, the Yasa, or Great Law, was another expression of the restructuring he was carrying out. While the full text of the Yasa has not survived and must be reconstructed from fragmentary references in various sources, its general character is clear enough. It established rules for the organization of military forces, for the treatment of conquered peoples, for the resolution of disputes, for the conduct of trade, and for various aspects of daily life. It was not, by any modern standard, a gentle legal code, but it was a code, systematic, consistent, and applied across the empire without regard to the ethnic or religious identity of those to whom it applied. The universality of its application was itself a political statement. Within the Mongol system, the law was the same for everyone. The role of women in Mongol society, and in Genghis Khan's own household and court, was significantly more substantial than popular imagination typically allows. Mongol women managed the household, which in the context of a nomadic empire meant managing the logistics of migration, the care of livestock, the maintenance of the gur or felt tent, and the education of children. In the periods when the men were away on campaign, which were frequent and prolonged, the women ran everything. The wives and mothers of Khans exercised real political influence, sometimes decisive political influence. Holan, Genghis Khan's mother, maintained the family through the years of abandonment and hardship that followed his father's death, and her qualities, resilience, resourcefulness, the fierce protectiveness of a woman who would not let her children be taken from her, were qualities that shaped her son. Borte, his primary wife, was consulted on matters of importance, and her counsel was valued. The regencies of subsequent generations of the empire were often conducted by women of the royal family, some of them with considerable effectiveness. A Mongol camp could not function without women, and this is not a sentimental observation, but a practical one. While men hunted, raided, negotiated, or rode on campaign, women managed the movement of herds, the production of food, the packing and raising of jars, the distribution of stored goods, and the weaving and maintenance of felt, rope, and clothing. They knew the animals, the children, the stores, the alliances created by marriage, and the resentments that could break those alliances apart. In a mobile society, household management was logistics, and logistics was power. This is why the women of the royal family could become political figures of real significance. They were not ornamental figures hidden away from the machinery of rule. They were often the people who kept that machinery moving when the men were absent or dead. Later Mongol history would see powerful Khattuns act as regents, negotiators, patrons, and kingmakers. Their authority did not erase the violence and patriarchy of the world they lived in, but it complicates the common image of steppe society as a world of men alone on horseback. The empire was carried by families, not only by warriors. The relationship between Genghis Khan and his 4 sons by Borte, Joki, Chagatai, Ogdi, and Talyui, was one of the defining dynamics of the later years of his life and of the empire he was building. Each son had his own character, his own strengths and limitations, his own supporters within the growing Mongol political system. Joki, the eldest, was a capable military leader but carried the shadow of his uncertain paternity, and the relationship between him and his father was complicated. Chagatai was rigid and conservative, a stickler for Mongol law and custom, and often in conflict with his eldest brother. Ogdi was warm, generous, sociable, and politically skillful, and it was Ogdi whom Genghis Khan eventually designated as his successor, a choice that surprised some, but that reflected a careful assessment of what the empire would need in the next generation. Talyui, the youngest, was the keeper of the hearth in Mongol tradition, the son who remained with the homeland and the main army, and he was a formidable military commander. The question of succession was one that Genghis Khan faced with unusual directness, given that the steppe tradition offered no clear model for the inheritance of an empire that had grown to this scale. He called his sons together and made them listen to him tell them what would happen to them if they could not cooperate. He used an image that has become famous, holding up a single arrow and breaking it easily, then holding up a bundle of arrows that could not be broken. The image of unity through combination was vivid and simple, and it conveyed what he understood better than almost anyone, that the Mongol achievement rested on a coalition that could dissolve if its members could not find a way to act together. The last years of his life were marked by continued campaign, including the final campaign against the Xia, which had broken its submission. The campaign was in progress when Genghis Khan died, in August of 1227. The exact cause of his death is not certain. Illness, a fall from a horse, wounds sustained in battle have all been proposed by different sources. He was perhaps in his early 60s, an old man by the standards of the medieval steppe. His death was kept secret until his eldest son Joki, who had predeceased him by a few months, in circumstances that also remain unclear, and the Xia campaign could be brought to a conclusion. The convoy carrying his body back to Mongolia passed through landscapes that had changed enormously during his lifetime, and the stories told about the return journey reflect the scale of what was being mourned. He was buried somewhere on or near the mountain called Burkhan Khaldan, which was sacred to him and to the Mongols, a place he had taken refuge at in moments of danger, a place he had always returned to as a spiritual home. The location of his tomb was deliberately concealed, and it has never been found. The land around the supposed burial site was declared sacred and off-limits, and the secrecy was maintained with such effectiveness that almost 2,000 years later, despite extensive archaeological surveys and satellite imaging, the grave of Genghis Khan remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The empire he left behind was the largest contiguous land empire in history, an area of approximately 24 million square kilometers at its greatest extent, stretching from the Pacific Ocean in the east to Eastern Europe and the Persian Gulf in the west. This figure is worth dwelling on. 24 million square kilometers. The modern Russian Federation, the largest country in the world, covers approximately 17 million square kilometers. The entire continent of North America covers approximately 24 million square kilometers. The Mongol Empire was, at its peak, as large as North America. This empire did not reach its maximum extent under Genghis Khan himself. He built the foundation and established the system. His successors, the four Khans who ruled after his death in sequence, his sons and grandsons, extended it further. Ogdi, his chosen successor, continued the campaigns in China and pushed west into Europe. Hulagu, a grandson, destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and took Baghdad in 1258 in one of the most catastrophic events of medieval Islamic history. The death of the last Abbasid Caliph and the destruction of a city that had been the center of Islamic learning and culture for 5 centuries. Another grandson, Kublai, completed the conquest of China and established the Yuan dynasty, becoming the ruler of the most populous country in the world and the patron of Marco Polo's famous visit. Yet another line of descent produced the rulers of the Golden Horde that dominated the steppes north of the Black Sea and the Caspian, and through them influenced the political development of Russia for 2 centuries. The successor states that emerged as the empire divided in the latter half of the 13th century, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and Iraq, the Golden Horde in the Western Steppe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, were not simply conquerors' states, imposing alien rule on subject peoples. Each adapted to the culture and administrative traditions of the territory it governed, creating hybrid states that were Mongol in their ruling elite and their military organization but absorbed local expertise, local religion, and local cultural forms into their governance. The Ilkhanate rulers converted to Islam. The Yuan dynasty patronized Chinese art and scholarship. The Golden Horde became deeply integrated with the steppe peoples of its territory and eventually gave rise, through complex political processes, to successor states that included the Kazakh, Uzbek, and Crimean Khanates. The division of the empire did not mean that the Mongol achievement had failed overnight. In some ways, division was inevitable. The distances were too great, the cultures too different, and the descendants of Genghis Khan too numerous and ambitious for one center to control everything forever. But even as the empire broke into khanates, the shared Chinggisid lineage remained politically powerful. To rule legitimately across much of Inner Asia, one needed some connection, real or claimed, to the house of Genghis Khan. His bloodline became a kind of political language, spoken from the Black Sea to China. This is one reason his influence lasted far beyond the lifetime of the United Empire. The successor states fought each other, made alliances, converted to different religions, adopted different administrative traditions, and gradually became less recognizably Mongol in daily culture. Yet they continued to live within a framework created by the original conquest. The map had changed. The imagination of power had changed. A man born in a small steppe community had created a standard of legitimacy that rulers centuries later still tried to borrow. The Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean world, had existed in various forms for centuries before the Mongol Empire. But under Mongol rule, it functioned with an effectiveness that it had rarely, if ever, achieved before. The Mongol guarantee of safe passage for merchants across the vast territory they controlled was a genuine and valuable thing. Merchants who registered with Mongol authorities received a peza, a tablet of authority that identified them as protected travelers, and could move across the empire with a degree of security that was remarkable for the era. The resulting commerce brought silk and porcelain from China to the markets of Persia and Europe, brought horses and silver from the west to the east, and carried with it the ideas, the technologies, and the germs that would reshape the connected world. Among the technologies that traveled along the Mongol-connected Silk Road were papermaking and printing from China, which would eventually contribute to the European printing revolution. Gunpowder, also of Chinese origin, traveled westward through the Mongol network. Mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, and medical understanding crossed from the Islamic world to China and vice versa. The famous traveler Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who spent approximately 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan in the 1270s and 1280s, and whose account of his travels, The Travels of Marco Polo, was dictated from memory while he was in a Genoese prison, described a world of extraordinary richness and complexity that his European readers found almost impossible to believe, but that subsequent history has confirmed in its essential outlines. Marco Polo's account, for all its occasional exaggeration and its gaps and inconsistencies, captures something real about the Mongol-connected world of the late 13th century. He described the courier system, the yam, a network of post stations spaced at regular intervals across the empire, allowing messages and small packages to travel from one end of the empire to the other in days rather than weeks or months. He described the paper money that the Yuan dynasty issued and enforced, one of the first large-scale experiments with fiat currency in world history. He described the coal that the Chinese burned for fuel, something unknown in medieval Europe. He described the cities of China, their populations, and their wealth, in terms that his readers found fantastic, but that archaeological and documentary evidence has confirmed as essentially accurate. The world that the Mongol Empire connected was, in many of its aspects, more advanced and more sophisticated than the Europe from which Marco Polo had come. The plague known as the Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century and killed approximately a third of the European population, also traveled along the Mongol-connected trade routes. Specifically, it appears to have originated in rodent populations in Central Asia and spread westward through the Mongol network, reaching the Black Sea coast and then traveling by ship to Italy in 1347. The same connectivity that carried silk and porcelain and ideas also carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. The Mongol peace was not without its terrible ironies, and the plague is the most terrible of them. The connected world that the empire created transmitted death as efficiently as it transmitted goods. The question of Genghis Khan's legacy is one that different cultures and different historical traditions have answered very differently. In Mongolia, he is the founding father of the nation. His image is on the currency. His name is given to the airport. His portrait hangs in government buildings, and his legacy is celebrated with a pride that encompasses the full complexity of what he represents. In China, where the Yuan dynasty is acknowledged as a legitimate part of Chinese imperial history, his legacy is complicated and contested. In Central Asia and the Islamic world, where the destruction of the Khwarezmian campaign and the fall of Baghdad left marks that lasted for generations, he is remembered with more ambivalence. Though his successors' conversion to Islam and their patronage of Islamic culture in the Ilkhanate complicate any simple narrative. In Europe, where the Mongol campaigns reached Poland and Hungary in the 1240s and struck terror into the courts of Western Europe, he remains a figure of distant, almost mythological destructiveness. None of these responses is wrong, exactly. Each captures something true about what the Mongol Empire meant to the people who encountered it, and what the memory of it has meant to the peoples who inherited that encounter. What none of them quite captures is the full strangeness of the story. The fact that this connected, devastating, transformative empire emerged from a felt tent on a steppe, from a boy who had nothing, who built everything with the force of his own understanding of human nature and his own capacity for the kind of clarity that comes from having very little to lose. The steppe that made Genghis Khan is still there. The grassland runs across the heart of Asia, from the Black Sea to the Pacific, the same wind moving through the same grass, the same enormous sky above it. The horses are still there, smaller breeds now, pastured in valleys that Mongol riders knew. The jers, the felt tents, are still there, in modified modern forms, still housing families who move with the seasons. The landscape has not forgotten what it made, and what it made has not forgotten the landscape. The secret history of the Mongols, which is the closest thing to an insider's account of Genghis Khan's life and character, ends with a passage about him that is worth noting. It describes him sitting, in old age, and speaking about the nature of the world and the nature of what he had done. He does not speak with the simple confidence of a man who believes he was always right. He speaks, in the rendering that has come down to us, as a man who understood that what he had built was made of the same fragile materials as everything else in the world: loyalty and luck and the willingness of other human beings to follow where he led. He knew it could not last forever. He built it anyway. The Mongol Empire, at its maximum extent, lasted approximately a century and a half before fragmenting into its component successor states. A century and a half. Not forever, as he must have known it would not be, but long enough to change the connections between East and West in ways that persisted. Long enough to break the barriers that had separated China from Persia, from Europe, from the steppe. Long enough to become one part of the chain through which knowledge preserved and developed in the Islamic world, and in China moved westward through Eurasian networks, eventually helping to widen the intellectual horizons of late medieval and Renaissance Europe. Long enough, in short, to contribute, in ways that are indirect and complicated and easy to miss, to the world that we inhabit tonight. The boy born on the banks of the Onan River, in a felt tent, in the cold of the Mongolian winter, who had nothing and built the largest empire in the history of the world, is gone. The empire is gone. The trade routes have changed their character. The cities that were destroyed have been rebuilt or replaced, or are now archaeological sites where researchers carefully sift through the evidence of what was lost. But the connections remain in the deep structure of the world, in the routes of commerce, in the transmission of ideas, in the hybridity of cultures that learn to inhabit each other's spaces under the enormous pressure of an empire that did not respect the borders between them. To understand how this transformation became possible, it is worth returning from the scale of the empire to the basic material of Mongol power, the horse. Without the horse, there is no Mongol army, no continental speed, no sudden appearance at distant frontiers, and no empire moving faster than its enemies could think. The horse culture of the Mongols deserves deeper attention than it typically receives, because without understanding the horse, it is impossible to understand how Genghis Khan achieved what he did. The horse was not simply a tool or a vehicle for the steppe people. It was the foundation of their entire way of life, their transportation, their source of meat and milk, their companion in war, and a being of deep cultural significance embedded in their religion, their poetry, and their understanding of the world. Mongol children learned to ride before they could walk steadily, placed on horseback as toddlers, and growing up with the movement of horses as natural to them as walking is to a child in a settled community. The Mongol horse, the Taki or Przewalski's horse and its descendants, was smaller than the European war horses of the medieval period, less impressive in individual appearance, but possessed of qualities that made it ideal for the demands of steppe warfare. It was extraordinarily hardy, capable of surviving on sparse grass without the supplemental feeding that European destriers required. It could endure cold that would kill a less robust animal. It was sure-footed in terrain that challenged larger breeds, and it reproduced in numbers that allowed Mongol armies to maintain the large strings of remounts that were central to their military effectiveness. A Mongol warrior who rode a horse to exhaustion simply switched to another and kept moving. This capacity for sustained speed over long distances was not merely a tactical advantage. It was a strategic one, allowing the Mongol army to cover distances and appear in places that their adversaries genuinely could not believe possible. The mare's milk, kumis, fermented to a mildly alcoholic drink, was a dietary staple that allowed the Mongol army to move with a level of self-sufficiency that would have been impossible for an army dependent on grain. A mounted Mongol warrior could travel for days on dried meat, borts, and kumis, his remounts providing food if necessary. This logistical independence meant that the Mongol army was not tied to supply lines in the way that most medieval armies were. They did not need to forage from settled agricultural areas in the same way and did not slow to the pace of supply wagons. They moved at the pace of horses because they effectively lived on horses. The training that produced Mongol warriors was inseparable from the hunting practices of the steppe. The nurj, the great communal hunt in which thousands of riders formed a vast encircling ring and gradually tightened it, driving game toward the center, was simultaneously a hunting method and a military exercise. It required exactly the skills that military operations required: coordination over large areas, the maintenance of a line that must not break or allow gaps, communication across distances that made verbal commands impossible, and the disciplined response to signals. A warrior who had participated in dozens of great hunts had been trained in all the essential tactical skills without knowing that was what he was doing. The hunt was the classroom. The steppe was the training ground. The shamanic religion of the Mongols, Tengrism, the worship of the eternal sky and the spirits of the land and the ancestors, provided Genghis Khan with a theological framework for his authority that complemented the purely military and political structures he was building. He presented himself as the representative of Tungri, the sky god, on earth, the man through whom the will of heaven was being expressed. This was not merely propaganda, though it certainly served propaganda purposes. It reflected a genuine worldview in which the cosmos was hierarchically organized and in which the supreme position in the human world naturally expressed the order of the divine world above it. The Mongol ruler's authority was legitimate not merely because he was strong enough to enforce it, but because heaven had decreed it. And the evidence that heaven had decreed it was precisely the fact that he was strong enough to enforce it. Success was its own theological argument. This framework also shaped the Mongol understanding of conquest. The demand for submission that Mongol armies typically sent ahead of their arrival was not simply a military ultimatum. It was a theological assertion. You are being invited to acknowledge the proper order of the world, in which Tungri rules the sky and the Great Khan rules the earth. Submission was not merely defeat. It was alignment with cosmic truth. Resistance, in this framework, was not merely military folly. It was cosmic impiety, a refusal to acknowledge what heaven had ordained, and the severity with which resistance was treated had a theological justification as well as a practical one. The way that Genghis Khan incorporated conquered peoples into his system is one of the most revealing aspects of his governance, and it distinguishes his approach from simple raiding or plundering. The pattern was consistent across many different contexts. After conquest, skilled craftsmen were separated from other captives and put to work for the Mongol war machine, producing weapons, armor, siege engines. Administrators who knew how to manage agricultural or urban populations were retained in their functions under Mongol supervision. Merchants were encouraged and protected because the Mongol rulers quickly understood that trade networks generated wealth that could be taxed and that connected the different parts of the empire. Religious leaders of all traditions were exempted from taxation because maintaining divine favor of whatever tradition was understood as a collective good. The meritocracy that Genghis Khan established within the Mongol military and administrative hierarchy was genuinely unusual for its era. The four great generals who appear most prominently in the history of the early empire, Gebe, Subutai, Macaulay, and Chilon, were of different backgrounds and different levels of birth. Gebe had actually been an enemy soldier who shot Genghis Khan's horse from under him in battle. When captured, he admitted this without flinching and offered his skills to the conqueror. Genghis Khan made him a general. Subutai was the son of a blacksmith. Macaulay was from a tribe that had been subordinate. None of these men would have risen to the positions they achieved in a system organized purely by birth. The Mongol system created space for talent that the steppe's old clan hierarchies had suppressed. Subutai deserves particular attention as perhaps the most militarily gifted of the great Mongol commanders. Some historians consider him the greatest military commander of the medieval world. He participated in more campaigns and won more battles than any other commander of his era, serving across a span of decades in theaters from China to Hungary. He was the architect of the Great Western Campaign of 1236 to 1242, in which Mongol forces under the nominal command of Bada Khan swept through Russia, Poland, and Hungary in a series of campaigns that left European rulers in a state of genuine terror and that have never been fully explained in terms of why the Mongols subsequently withdrew. The Battle of Mohi in Hungary in 1241, which Subutai planned and executed, was one of the most tactically sophisticated battles of the medieval period, involving a coordinated double envelopment of a large Hungarian army that left perhaps 60,000 dead. The withdrawal of the Mongol forces from Hungary in 1242, just when they seemed poised to push further west into the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, has been debated by historians ever since. Various explanations have been offered. The death of the great Khan Ogdi requiring the princes to return east for the selection of a successor, the logistical difficulty of maintaining a large Mongol force in the more densely populated and differently organized landscape of Western Europe, the resistance of several well-fortified positions that had proved difficult to take, or some combination of all of these. What is clear is that the withdrawal was a decision, not a defeat, and that the Mongol military capacity to continue west was real. Europe was saved from further invasion not by a military check, but by political circumstances in distant Mongolia, which tells us something important about the nature of the empire and the dependencies it had created. The impact of the Mongol invasions on Russia deserves particular attention because of the long-term political consequences. The Rus principalities, Kiev, Vladimir, Suzdal, and the others, were attacked and many were devastated beginning in 1237. Kiev, one of the great cities of medieval Europe and the cultural and religious center of the Rus world, was destroyed in 1240. The political fragmentation that the Mongol campaigns accelerated among the Rus principalities contributed to the conditions from which Moscow eventually emerged as the dominant power, partly because Moscow's position was more defensible, partly because its princes learned to navigate the relationship with the Golden Horde skillfully, and partly because the destruction of rival centers cleared the way for Muscovite expansion. The Mongol period in Russian history, the so-called Tatar yoke that lasted approximately 2.5 centuries in various forms, shaped Russian political culture in ways that historians continue to debate. The centralization of power, the importance of military capacity in state formation, the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, all of these were influenced by the experience of Mongol dominance. The transmission of knowledge across the Mongol Empire's trade routes is visible in specific, traceable instances that connect the world before and after Genghis Khan. Chinese astronomical knowledge traveled west, contributing to the Islamic astronomical tradition that would later, through European translation, influence the Copernican revolution. Islamic mathematical and astronomical knowledge traveled east, influencing the development of Chinese science. The printing techniques of China, woodblock printing and later movable type, were known in the Mongol world and may have contributed to the development of European printing, though the direct connection is debated. The techniques of silk production, which had been closely guarded by China for centuries, spread westward through the Mongol network, eventually reaching Persia and the Byzantine world and ultimately Western Europe. The agricultural technologies of one region were sometimes deliberately introduced to others by Mongol administrators who understood that agricultural productivity was the foundation of the tax revenue on which the empire depended. The religious landscape of the Mongol Empire was one of extraordinary diversity, and the Mongol approach to this diversity was one of the most genuinely tolerant in the medieval world. Nestorian Christianity, a form of Christianity that had been pushed to the margins of the mainstream church by theological disputes in the 5th century, but that had spread eastward along the Silk Road, was practiced by significant communities across Central Asia and had adherents at the very top of the Mongol royal family. Several of Genghis Khan's daughters-in-law were Nestorian Christians. Buddhism was the predominant religion in much of East Asia and had Mongol royal patrons. Islam was the faith of the majority in Central Asia and Persia, and the Ilkhanate rulers eventually converted to it. Tibetan Buddhism, the form that would eventually come to be associated with the Dalai Lama, received patronage from Kublai Khan and spread its influence across the empire through this royal connection. This religious coexistence was not without tensions, and there were episodes of favoritism and disadvantage that complicated the overall picture. But the framework of toleration was real, maintained across generations of Mongol rule, and it stands in striking contrast to the religious exclusivity that characterized many other medieval polities. The Mongol court, at its most cosmopolitan, was a place where a Franciscan friar from Flanders could meet a Nestorian priest from Baghdad, a Buddhist monk from Tibet, and a Taoist sage from China, all in the same audience hall, all seeking the favor of the same ruler, all protected by the same imperial decree that their beliefs and their persons were inviolate. The administration of the empire after Genghis Khan's death was an ongoing challenge that his successors met with varying degrees of success. The fundamental problem was scale. The empire was simply too large to be governed from a single center, and the communication and transportation technologies available even with the Yam relay system were not adequate to maintain tight central control over territories separated by thousands of kilometers. The solution, worked out imperfectly over several generations, was the division of the empire among the descendants of Genghis Khan's 4 sons, with the Great Khan, the ruler of Mongolia and China, theoretically supreme, but in practice increasingly a first among equals as the successor states developed their own administrative traditions and their own political interests. The Kurultai, the great assembly of Mongol princes that was required to select a new great Khan, was the mechanism through which the Mongol political system maintained its collegial character. Every great Khan required confirmation by a Kurultai, and the politicking that surrounded these assemblies could be intense and prolonged. The selection of Ogdi after Genghis Khan's death was relatively straightforward, since the designation had been made in advance. But subsequent successions were more contested, and the delays caused by the requirement to assemble princes from across the empire contributed to strategic indecision at critical moments. The Mongol Empire's relationship with the settled urban world it conquered evolved significantly over the century of its existence. The early campaigns, under Genghis Khan and Ogdi, were characterized by devastating raids and the destruction of cities that resisted. But as the empire settled into something more permanent, the economic value of productive settled populations became apparent, and the approach changed. Ogdi's chief administrator in northern China, a Khitan official named Yelu Chukai, made the case directly to the Great Khan that the Chinese peasantry was worth more alive and productive than dead, that the agricultural output they generated would provide a revenue stream far more valuable than any one-time plunder. The argument was accepted, and it represents a significant turning point in how the Mongol rulers thought about their relationship with the people they ruled. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai Khan established in China was, in many respects, the most complete expression of what the Mongol Empire could become when its rulers genuinely engaged with the civilization they had conquered. Kublai was fascinated by China, by its history, its culture, its administrative traditions, its intellectual life. He patronized Chinese scholars and artists alongside Mongol ones. He built his capital at Khanbaliq, the city of the Khan, on the site of modern Beijing, in a style that blended Mongol and Chinese architectural traditions. He extended the Grand Canal to connect his capital to the agricultural south. He maintained the Chinese civil service examination system, though with some modifications that reflected Mongol political priorities. And he was the ruler that Marco Polo served and described, the emperor of a domain so wealthy and so well organized that European readers of Polo's account could not believe it was real. The fall of the Yuan dynasty in China in 1368, replaced by the native Chinese Ming dynasty, marked the end of Mongol rule in the most populous part of the empire. The Ming rejection of Mongol influence was thorough and deliberate. Chinese emperors rebuilt the Great Wall, which Genghis Khan had breached, and attempted to limit contact with the steppe world that had produced their conquerors. But the legacy of Mongol rule in China was not entirely erased. The administrative structures, the canal systems, the capital city, the integration of China into a broader Eurasian economic network, all of these persisted in modified form. The genetic legacy of Genghis Khan is itself a remarkable fact. A study published in 2003 found that approximately 8% of men living in the former territory of the Mongol Empire, an area stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian, carry a Y chromosome haplotype that appears to have originated in Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago. Given the pattern of distribution, the most likely explanation is descent from a single male ancestor who lived in Mongolia approximately a millennium ago, which is to say, approximately when Genghis Khan was alive. If this interpretation is correct, it means that roughly 16 million men alive today are direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan. This is, if accurate, the largest genetic legacy of any individual in human history, made possible by the reproductive opportunities that the Mongol system created for Genghis Khan's direct male descendants, who populated the courts and harems of the successor kingdoms across Asia. The Silk Road under the Mongols carried not only goods and ideas, but people, travelers of every kind, for every purpose. The Christian mission to the Mongol court is a fascinating thread in this story. Beginning with Pope Innocent IV's dispatch of John of Plano Carpini in 1245, a Franciscan friar who made the remarkable journey to the Mongol court at Karakorum and back, writing an account of his travels that is one of the earliest European descriptions of Central Asia and Mongolia, and continuing through William of Rubruck's mission in 1253 and Marco Polo's extended stay from approximately 1271 to 1295, the Mongol world was the subject of growing European curiosity and strategic assessment. The European courts were aware that the Mongols had destroyed the Islamic powers of Central Asia and Persia, and there were periodic, ultimately unsuccessful attempts to forge a Mongol-Christian alliance against the Muslim powers of the Middle East. The diplomatic correspondence that passed between European and Mongol courts in this period is itself a fascinating document of a world trying to understand its own changed dimensions. John of Plano Carpini was 65 years old when he made the journey to the Mongol court, and his account of it, the Historia Mongolorum, is written with the precision of a man who understood that he was gathering intelligence as well as fulfilling a religious mission. He describes the Mongol military system with professional interest, noting the discipline, the organization, the tactics, and the morale of Mongol forces with a clarity that suggests he was taking notes carefully. He describes the Mongol court with an ethnographer's eye, the felt tents, the ceremonial procedures, the food and drink, the religious practices, the social hierarchy. His is the earliest European eyewitness account of the Mongol world, and it remains one of the most reliable. The response that Carpini received from the great Khan Gayuk, Ogedi's son, who had just been selected at a Kurultai, to Pope Innocent's letter is itself a remarkable document. Gayuk's letter, which has survived in its original form in the Vatican archives, tells the Pope that if he wishes to have peace, he must come to Mongolia and submit to the Great Khan. The letter is a statement of the Mongol theological political position in its clearest form. The Great Khan is the representative of heaven on earth, and all rulers must acknowledge this or face the consequences. The letter was received in Europe with something between bewilderment and alarm, and the proposed meeting never took place. The idea of what the Mongols were continued to evolve in the European imagination across the medieval and early modern periods. The terror that accompanied the invasions of 1241 gave way, in subsequent generations, to a more complex picture as trade and diplomatic contacts multiplied. The figure of Prester John, the legendary Christian king of the East who was believed to be preparing to attack Islam from behind, a figure that various European writers attempted to identify with Mongol rulers, reflects the wishful thinking of a Europe that wanted the Mongols to be allies. The reality was more complicated, as always. The steppe from which all of this emerged has its own history that continues long after the Mongol Empire's dissolution. The political and cultural descendants of the Mongol world, the various Turkic-Mongol peoples of Central Asia and the successor Khanates, continued to shape the history of Eurasia for centuries. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, who built a new empire across Central Asia and Persia in the late 14th century, claimed descent from Genghis Khan and explicitly identified his authority with the Mongol tradition. The Mughal Empire of India, one of the wealthiest and most cultured polities in the world during the 16th and 17th centuries, was founded by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, and the word Mughal is itself a version of Mongol. The Safavid dynasty of Persia, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire as it expanded across Siberia, all of these later powers were shaped, in various ways, by their relationship with the Mongol legacy. The secret history of the Mongols, composed in the decades after Genghis Khan's death, is itself a document that rewards slow, careful reading. It is not a court chronicle in the formal sense. It has the quality of an oral tradition written down, with the rhythms and the repetitions and the sudden vivid details of a story that was told and retold before it was said in text. It preserves the texture of the world it describes in a way that more formal historical writing does not. The dialogue is direct, sometimes surprisingly blunt. The characters have distinct voices. The landscape is present. The rivers and mountains and steppe of Mongolia appear as active participants in the narrative, not merely as backdrop. Reading it is to feel genuinely close to the world it describes, in a way that few historical documents achieve. What the secret history tells us about Genghis Khan, in the aggregate, is that he was a man who understood people with unusual depth. He knew what motivated loyalty and what eroded it. He knew the difference between a man who was loyal from fear and a man who was loyal from genuine attachment, and he preferred the latter because he understood that the former would fail at the critical moment. He knew how to read a situation in which his own position was weak and find the path that preserved and extended it. He knew when to be patient and when to strike. He knew the steppe and what it demanded of the people who lived on it, and he built a system that harnessed those demands rather than fighting against them. These qualities, the reading of human nature, the patience, the strategic clarity, the ability to inspire loyalty and maintain it across decades, are not qualities that belong to any particular civilization or any particular time. They are human qualities, rare in their intensity and their combination, and they appear occasionally in individuals who become figures that history does not forget. What is particular to Genghis Khan is the context in which these qualities operated. The steppe world, the fractured Mongol tribes, the specific historical moment in which the established powers of Asia were vulnerable to a force they had not encountered in this form before. The qualities met the moment, and the result was the largest land empire in history. The silence of the steppe at night is not empty silence. It is full of what the steppe has been, the generations of riders who crossed it, the armies that formed and dissolved upon it, the herds that grazed it, the fires that burned across it in the vast ritual hunts. Standing on the steppe at night, or imagining it, as we rest here, the wind moves through the grass with a sound that is almost like breathing, almost like the landscape is alive and thinking. Perhaps it is. Perhaps the places that have held the weight of great events carry something of those events in themselves, not in any mystical sense, but in the simple physical fact that they persist while the events they hosted do not, and that encountering them is to be put in contact with the deep time that underlies the surface of the present moment. Genghis Khan understood the steppe in this way. He knew its patience and its power. He was made by it, and what he made was an expression of it, the landscape's own scale and emptiness and capacity for sudden, overwhelming movement, translated into human form. The empire was the steppe made political, and like the steppe, it was vast and difficult to hold and ultimately ungovernable by a single will, but also, like the steppe, it persisted in some form long after its most dramatic expressions had faded. The wind tonight, wherever you are, is the same wind that moved through the Mongolian grass when Temujin was a boy on the banks of the Onon. Time does not change the wind. It only changes what the wind moves through. The economics of the Mongol Empire reveal a sophistication that is often overlooked in accounts that focus only on military campaigns. The Mongol rulers quickly understood that the destruction of productive agricultural and commercial infrastructure was counterproductive, that the real value of conquest lay not in the one-time extraction of wealth from a sacked city, but in the ongoing flow of tax revenue, tribute, and commercial activity that a functioning economy generated. This understanding, which developed unevenly across the empire and was more clearly grasped by some rulers than others, drove the shift from pure raiding to something more like governance that is visible in the second generation of Mongol rule. The paper money issued by the Yuan dynasty, Jiaoqiao, backed by the authority of the state rather than by a fixed quantity of metal, was one of the most significant financial experiments of the pre-modern world. Kublai Khan extended the use of paper money across his domain and enforced its acceptance with the full weight of imperial authority. The system worked because of the power that enforced it, and it generated significant revenue for the state through the seigniorage, the profit from issuing money at face value greater than the cost of the paper. Marco Polo describes the paper money system with a combination of amazement and admiration that reflects how strange it seemed to a European accustomed to metallic currency. The concept did not immediately transfer to Europe, but the precedent was real, and the eventual development of European paper currency centuries later drew on the accumulated global experience of which the Mongol experiment was a part. The merchant class occupied a protected and valued position within the Mongol system in a way that distinguished Mongol governance from many other medieval polities. Merchants provided the great khans with goods unavailable on the steppe, information about conditions in distant regions, and the commercial revenue on which the imperial system depended. The Mongols invested in commercial infrastructure, improving roads, maintaining the postal relay system, clearing trade routes of bandits, in ways that directly benefited merchants. The Ortok system, a form of state-sponsored commercial partnership in which Mongol nobles invested capital with merchant partners who conducted the actual trade, integrated the ruling class directly into the commercial economy, giving them a financial stake in the prosperity of the trade networks. This alignment of political and economic interests created conditions in which trade could flourish on a scale that had no prior precedent. The cities that the Mongols built or rebuilt, Karakorum in Mongolia, Khanbaliq in China, Tabriz in the Ilkhanate, were expressions of what the empire could become at its most constructive. Karakorum, the first capital of the empire, was described by William of Rubruck as a relatively modest place surrounded by earthworks, with two main streets of Chinese merchants and Muslim traders, 12 Buddhist temples, 2 mosques, and a Nestorian church, a religious geography that captures in miniature the cosmopolitan character of the empire. Khanbaliq, built by Kublai on a much larger scale, was a planned city of regular streets and premeditated grandeur that would serve as the template for the later development of Beijing. Tabriz, the capital of the Ilkhanate in northwestern Iran, grew under Mongol patronage into one of the wealthiest trading cities in the world, its markets supplied with goods from China, India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. The patronage of art and learning by the Mongol courts, particularly in the Ilkhanate and the Yuan dynasty, produced works of extraordinary quality and historical importance. The Ilkhanate patronized a tradition of illustrated manuscript production that synthesized Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian artistic traditions into something new and distinctive. The great Persian historian Rashid al-Din, who served the Ilkhanate court as a physician and administrator and who produced the Compendium of Chronicles, arguably the first world history, drawing on Chinese, Mongol, Indian, Persian, and Islamic historical traditions, did so with access to the Mongol archives and to scholars from across the empire that no previous historian had enjoyed. His work survives in illustrated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty, and it represents one of the most significant intellectual achievements of the medieval period. The astronomical observatory established by the Ilkhan Hulagu at Moraga in northwestern Iran in the 1250s was another expression of this patronage. The observatory attracted scholars from across the Islamic world and from China, combining astronomical traditions from different civilizations into a unified program of sky observation and mathematical analysis that significantly advanced the accuracy of astronomical tables and the understanding of planetary motion. The work done at Moraga influenced subsequent Islamic astronomy and, eventually, through the transmission of Islamic astronomical knowledge to Renaissance Europe, contributed to the context from which Copernicus's heliocentric model emerged. The observatory was, in a sense, a product of the same connectivity that the Mongol Empire created, a place where knowledge from different traditions could meet and generate something new. The Mongol postal system, the YAM, deserves extended discussion because it was one of the most significant administrative achievements of the empire and because its implications went far beyond simple message delivery. The YAM consisted of a network of stations, some sources say thousands of them, spaced approximately 25 to 40 kilometers apart across the empire, each stocked with fresh horses, food for riders, and accommodation. A rider carrying official dispatches could cover 200 to 400 kilometers in a day, switching horses at each station, eating and drinking without stopping. A message originating in Khanbaliq in China could reach the western provinces of the empire in a matter of days rather than the weeks or months that travel by ordinary means would require. This speed of communication was not merely convenient. It was transformative. It allowed the central court to maintain awareness of events at the edges of the empire with a rapidity that no previous large-scale polity had achieved. It allowed military commanders to coordinate operations across distances that would otherwise have made coordination impossible. It allowed merchants to receive market intelligence quickly enough to act on it profitably. And it allowed the Mongol rulers to project the sense of their presence through the constant movement of officials, dispatches, and goods along the YAM, across a territory too large for any single ruler to physically visit. The YAM also carried travelers other than official couriers, diplomats, merchants, scholars, and pilgrims who obtained the peza, the authorization tablet that identified them as protected travelers, could use the YAM stations and receive the food and horses and accommodation they provided. This system of authorized travel created a kind of imperial highway network that the Silk Road's trade routes and pilgrimage paths had not previously had. It is the context in which Marco Polo traveled, the context in which the Chinese Buddhist monk Rabban Sauma traveled from China to Rome as an ambassador of the Ilkhanate in 1287, and the context in which the flow of people and ideas that characterized the Pax Mongolica was actually organized and sustained. Rabban Sauma's journey is one of the remarkable episodes of medieval history that deserves to be much better known than it is. He was an Nestorian Christian monk of Turkic origin who had made a pilgrimage from China toward Jerusalem, met the Ilkhanid patriarch Mar Yabalaha in Persia, and eventually served as an ambassador of the Ilkhanid court to the Christian rulers of Europe. He visited Constantinople, Rome, Paris, and Genoa, meeting the Byzantine Emperor, Pope Nicholas IV, King Philip IV of France, and King Edward I of England. His account of his travels in the West, which survives in a Syriac text, describes the churches and rulers of Europe with the same combination of curiosity and occasional puzzlement that European travelers like Carpini and Polo brought to their descriptions of the East. He attended Easter Mass in Rome, visited the tombs of the apostles, and reported on the theological controversies of the Latin Church with the slightly detached interest of an outsider. He is the only medieval traveler who made the journey from China to Europe and left a written account, and his account is a reminder that the information flow across the Mongol world ran in both directions. The relationship between the Mongol conquests and the development of European cartography is another thread in the larger story of the empire's intellectual legacy. Before the Mongol period, European maps of Asia were largely based on ancient Greek geography, supplemented by the accounts of pilgrims and traders and filtered through layers of religious symbolism. The Mongol campaigns and the subsequent era of Mongol-facilitated travel produced a flood of new geographical information that eventually transformed how Europeans understood the shape, of Asia. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most sophisticated medieval maps of the world, reflects the accumulated geographical knowledge generated by Polo and other Mongol-era travelers. It shows China, Central Asia, and the Indian Ocean with a geographic accuracy that is visibly superior to earlier maps. This improved understanding of Asian geography did not cause the age of European exploration by itself, but it formed part of the background against which later navigators imagined the size and shape of the world. Columbus and Vasco da Gama still sailed into uncertainty, but they did so in a world whose map had been enlarged by the journeys and reports of the Mongol era. The question of the Mongol Empire's relationship to the formation of the modern world, to the set of economic, political, and cultural conditions from which the contemporary globalized world emerged, is one that historians have addressed with increasing seriousness in recent decades. The argument, in its most developed form, goes something like this. The Mongol Empire, by connecting Eurasia into a single zone of exchange for roughly a century, created conditions that accelerated the flow of goods, ideas, and people across distances that had previously been traversed only slowly and with great difficulty. This acceleration had specific consequences: the spread of plague, the transmission of Chinese and Islamic knowledge to Europe, the growth of long-distance trade that enriched Italian city-states and helped finance the Renaissance, the geographic knowledge that enabled European exploration. Each of these developments had in turn further consequences, cascading forward through time. The world that Christopher Columbus sailed from in 1492 was, in subtle but real ways, a world that had been shaped by the Mongol Empire of 2 centuries earlier. This argument does not make Genghis Khan responsible for the modern world. The causal chains are too long and too branched for that kind of reduction. But it does suggest that the impact of the Mongol Empire on subsequent history was deeper and more lasting than the destruction alone would indicate, and that understanding this impact requires looking at the full range of what the empire created, the connections as well as the devastations, the transmissions as well as the terminations. The landscape of Mongolia today carries the weight of all of this history in a way that is palpable to those who travel through it. The grassland is still vast, still windswept, still organized around the movement of animals and the felt tent. The horses still graze in valleys between low hills. The sky is still enormous. The distance between human settlements is still measured in hours of riding rather than minutes of walking. Modern Mongolia has cities and roads and schools and internet connections, but the fundamental geography that shaped the steppe culture of Genghis Khan's time is still there, still present, still conditioning the way people relate to space and movement in the natural world. The national identity of Mongolia is inseparable from Genghis Khan in a way that creates its own complexities. He is simultaneously the founder of the nation, the source of legitimate national pride, and a figure whose methods of conquest create difficult questions for a modern democratic state that values human rights. These tensions are not unique to Mongolia. Many nations carry similar ambivalences about founding figures whose achievements came at great cost and human suffering. But the scale in Mongolia's case is particularly stark, and the way the society navigates it, celebrating the unity and the achievement while acknowledging the costs, is itself a kind of ongoing historical education. The physical evidence of the Mongol world that survives, the ruins of Karakorum, the archaeological remains of campsites and fortresses across Central Asia, the manuscripts produced in the Ilkhanate and the Yuan dynasty, the coins that circulated across the empire, the pages that authorized travel, the grave goods found in the burials of Mongol nobles. All of this physical material tells a story that is more complex and more human than any simple narrative of destruction or of triumph can capture. The Mongol world was a human world, populated by human beings with human needs and human fears and human desires. who lived and died within a political and military system of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary cost. The great distance of time that separates us from Genghis Khan, 8.5 centuries, does not make him less real or less present. It makes him more mysterious in some ways, because the specific texture of daily life in 13th century Mongolia is harder to recover than the political and military outlines of the empire. We know the campaigns and their results. We know the administrative structures and their logic. We know the names of the generals and the battles. What we know less clearly is the smell of a Mongol camp at dawn, the sound of 10,000 horses moving across the steppe, the texture of the felt that lined the great tent of the great Khan, the quality of the firelight by which the secret history was first told aloud to an audience who knew all the people it described. We should also remember the ordinary people caught inside this enormous story. A merchant leading camels through the cold of Central Asia. A Persian potter trying to restart a kiln after a city had changed rulers. A Chinese clerk copying tax records for new masters whose language he did not speak. A Mongol girl learning to milk mares at dawn while her brothers practiced with bows. A Rus monk watching smoke rise from a city after an invasion. A Muslim astronomer at Moraga calculating the movement of planets under the patronage of a Mongol ruler. These lives were not footnotes to the empire. They were the empire as it was actually lived. History often gives us the names of khans and generals because those names were attached to documents, battles, and dynasties. But a world this large was made of unnamed lives. Some were broken by the conquest. Some were protected by the order that followed. Some carried goods farther than their grandparents could have imagined. Some learned new words, new measurements, new gods, new fears. The Mongol Empire was not an idea moving across a map. It was millions of human beings forced, invited, frightened, enriched, displaced, or connected by a change too large for any one of them to understand completely while it was happening. That world is gone. What remains of it are traces in the historical sources, in the archaeological record, in the genetics of the populations descended from those who lived within the empire, in the languages and cultural practices that the Mongol period influenced, and in the deep structure of the Eurasian world that the empire connected. These traces are enough to reconstruct a picture, imperfect and partial but genuine, of something that happened, of a boy who had nothing and built the largest land empire in history, of an empire that shook the world and changed the connections between its parts forever. The wind moves through the Mongolian grass tonight, as it always has. The stars turn above the steppe as they turned above the Kurultai of 1206 when a man in his 40s was named the ruler of all those who lived in felt tents. The Onon River runs through the same valley where he was born, and somewhere in the earth of that sacred mountain, Burkhan Khaldun, the site of his burial. The man who was Temujin before he was Genghis Khan rests in a silence that the centuries have not broken and that perhaps the centuries will not break. His name is known to every person on earth. His story is told in every language. His tomb has never been found. Some things endure by being found. Others endure by remaining hidden, present in everything they shaped, invisible in themselves, complete in the mystery of their absence. The question of what Genghis Khan himself thought about what he was doing, what his inner life was like, what motivated him beyond the immediate imperatives of survival and power, is one that the historical sources approach only obliquely. The secret history gives us passages that suggest reflection and even something like philosophical questioning. But these have been filtered through the assumptions and purposes of the people who composed the text, and they cannot be taken as direct transcriptions of the man's thoughts. What can be said is that he appears, from the evidence available, to have been a man who thought seriously about the nature of power and loyalty and the conditions that made great enterprises possible. His reported deathbed conversations with Yelu Chukai and with others suggest a man who was thinking about what would come after him and what conditions were necessary for it to survive. He understood that the empire was held together by his personal authority and by the loyalty that he had built through decades of consistent behavior, and he worried, with good reason, as it turned out, that the division of the empire among his sons would create the conditions for fragmentation. The instruction he gave about remaining unified, the bundle of arrows that cannot be broken. These are the thoughts of a man who understood that what he had built was more fragile than its scale suggested. The specific instructions he left about his burial, the concealment of the site, the prohibition on visiting it, the killing of everyone who witnessed the funeral procession so that the location could not be revealed, reflect a belief that his resting place needed to be protected from disturbance. The steppe tradition of not marking graves elaborately was partly behind this, but the deliberate concealment suggests something more specific, a desire to remain, in death, as he had been in life, powerful and present through absence rather than display. The empty, unmarked landscape of Mongolia carries his presence more completely than any monument could, because the landscape is what made him, and it continues to exist in its essential character while the man and his empire are gone. He was born with nothing. He built the largest land empire in history. He died in a felt tent-on campaign, as he had lived. He was buried in an unmarked place that no one has found. The empire he built lasted a century and a half before fragmenting, and its fragments shaped the world for centuries more. The people who carry his genetic legacy number in the tens of millions. The ideas he put in motion about religious tolerance, about meritocracy and military command, about the organization of trade across continental distances, influenced the development of subsequent empires and continue to be discussed by historians and political thinkers. What remains at the end of all of this is the steppe in the sky and the grass moving in the wind. The Onon River still runs. The mountain called Burkhan Khaldun still rises above the surrounding plain. The stars still turn in the enormous sky that he watched from his childhood. The man himself is gone. The empire is gone. And yet the structures set in motion by that empire continued to shape trade, war, law, diplomacy, religion, and historical memory long after the Mongol banners disappeared from the horizon. And so we come to the end of this history. We have followed a boy born with nothing on the banks of the Onon River to the title of Genghis Khan, universal ruler. We have traced the empire he built across the Eurasian continent, through campaigns, cities, trade routes, religious courts, postal stations, libraries, and ruined walls. We have sat with the complexity of what he created, destruction and connection, violence and tolerance, discipline and terror, the fragility of everything built from human loyalty and human ambition. He changed the world. The Silk Road moved more freely under Mongol authority than it had for centuries. The ideas and technologies of China and the Islamic world traveled west along routes his armies had opened. The plague traveled the same routes, at enormous cost. The world that came after him, the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and the more connected modern world, carries within it traces of what he set in motion. Genghis Khan was not simple. Nothing about him was simple. That is why the story still matters. It refuses an easy moral shape. It shows how survival can become power, how power can become conquest, how conquest can destroy and connect at the same time, and how one life can change the map of history without ever controlling what that change will become. Sleep well. Good night.